Hi, everyone. Welcome back and welcome to week 5. I hope that you're all enjoying the class and learning a lot about the sociological perspective on health and illness. This week's readings focused on the social meanings of illness. And I think your chapter does a pretty good job of laying out a lot of that. What I want to focus on for this lecture, and this will be the only lecture for this week, is the idea that medicine is used as an instrument, or that the medical institution, the institution of medicine, is an agent of social control. So I'm going to sort of zoom in on that idea in this lecture and give you a couple of examples of how this works. Um, so first, let's sort of back up. What does this even mean, this idea that the institution of medicine is an agent of social control? Well, medicine is thought of as a social institution. So sociologists talk about medicine, broadly speaking, as a social institution. And basically, a social institution is a complex group of interdependent positions. So in your textbook, the author refers to this as enduring social structure. So she calls a social institution an enduring social structure. Basically, what that means is that you have this very large and complicated web of people working together in different social roles, right? In different capacities. They all have a job to do, sort of bigger than we can really wrap our minds around. And they all come together to perform a particular role in society. They meet some kind of basic human need. So it's obvious that the institution of medicine is aimed at people's health, right? But there are other social institutions like the family, which is in charge of continuing the species and socializing children into our society. You have education, right, which is also tasked with socializing children, but also educating people, right? So social institutions perform social roles in society. They meet some kind of societal human need, and they also shape human behavior. So they just sort of by virtue of the way that they operate tend to encourage people to follow social norms. So this idea of an enduring social structure or a complex group of interdependent positions, I think, is the hardest thing to understand when it comes to understanding social institutions. So let me just sort of like give you a simplified version of what this looks like. While medicine is a complex group of interconnected positions, right? The field of medicine, the institution of medicine, you've got what you probably imagine first, doctors and patients. You've got physical therapists and their patients. You've got pharmacists and pharmaceutical companies, which play a really big role in the institution of medicine. And we'll talk about pharmaceutical companies when we get to healthcare. EMTs, medical researchers and scientific researchers. Hospitals and all of the people who work there and the administration of that hospital, right? That includes people who work in HR, people who work in maintenance and janitorial staff, the doctors, the nurses, the physician's assistants, all the people who work in the hospitals, and the function of that hospital itself. You have government entities like the Illinois Department of Public Health, for example. And then you have larger organizations geared toward medicine and health, like the World Health Organization in the US. You can think of the National Institutes of Health, which is an arm of the government that oversees research on health. You could think of the Centers for Disease Control, which we've talked about earlier this term. So all of these entities, right, are part of this complex web of interconnected positions that make up the field of medicine. And so if we think of social institutions as agents of social control, and in particular, if we think of the institution of medicine as an agent of social control, what does that mean? Well, in your textbook, the author says that medicine is a basic structure of our society that sometimes serves to keep people in line. A really famous sociologist named Peter Conrad, famous to me, maybe not famous to you, but he writes a lot on this idea of the social construction of illness, which we'll talk about in a second. And he talks about medicine as an agent of social control in terms of medicine really wanting to secure our adherence to social norms, right? That medicine intends to minimize, eliminate, or normalize deviant behavior. And so, what's really important for this idea that the institution of medicine is an agent of social control is this idea of social constructionism. And social constructionism is sort of the foundational element of the sociological understanding of illness. So, in your textbook, the author makes this distinction in chapter 5 between the medical model of illness, where we see illness as being objective, and the sociological model of illness, where illness is subjective. So remember back in chapter 2 that she also distinguishes between disease, right, which is a biological problem within an individual, and illness, which is the social experience of having a disease. So under the medical model, this idea of illness is like you have it or you don't. There's really no arguing about it. Like there's a set of objective criteria. You have the disease, you have the illness. You just have it. That's it. The sociological model focuses a little bit more on this idea of subjectivity. Okay. And if you want a comparison of this, there's a really nice table in your book on page 103. From the sociological perspective, illness is a social construction. So we as human beings define what is illness and what is not illness. Sometimes illness is contested. We may not agree, right? Like the experts may not agree on whether a particular set of symptoms, for example, constitutes an illness. And we can negotiate the meaning of a particular illness. In one period of time, something may be defined by the experts as an illness, and later on it may not, or vice versa. Another reason that sociologists see illness as subjective, right, is that it's seen as a moral stance, right? So it's always posed in contrast to quote unquote normality, right? So if you're ill, you're not normal. If you think about the way we talk about mental illness, people who we deem to be mentally ill are not normal, right? And if you're not normal, it sort of implies that you're not good. And if you're not good, then that casts a moral judgment on being ill. So if you're ill, the logic follows that you're somehow not good, not normal. You're bad, and that varies depending on what kind of illness you have, but it's always seen as sort of deviant. Sociologists also recognize that illness is the result of both social and biological causes. So it's not as if sociologists are saying that everybody just makes up illness. We recognize that illness is attached to disease, and that there are diseases that have objective criteria. But there is a social component to illness, and there's a really influential paper written by a sociologist in 1970. Friedson says when a physician diagnoses a human's condition as an illness, they change the person's behavior by diagnosis. A social state is added by assigning the meaning of illness to a disease. It is in this sense that the physicians create illness, and that illness is analytically and empirically distinct from mere disease. So what this person is saying is that once a doctor tells you that you have a disease, you are now categorized as somebody as having that disease, and you are somebody who is now experiencing your life as somebody who has that disease. You don't learn of a diagnosis and then move on with your life and it has no effect on you whatsoever. Typically, being diagnosed with something changes you from a social perspective. You react to it, you change your behavior, you think about the world differently. There's a social experience that is attached to diagnosing a disease. That is the experience of illness. And so when sociologists look at illness, they ask a lot of different questions, but two that I'll point out are first, who gets to decide what illness is? For example, who has the power to decide what is illness and what is not? If you look back, if you go back to the array of pictures that I just showed you, who there has the power to decide what's an illness and what's not? And the second question that sociologists would ask is the determination of illness applied equally? So there's a lot of research that shows that doctors, for example, physicians or psychiatrists may diagnose some groups of people with a particular disease more frequently than they would diagnose another group of people. There's an experiment showing that when two people of different racial groups presented the same psychiatric symptoms, one was diagnosed with schizophrenia, that was tended to be black men, and others were not diagnosed with schizophrenia. So this idea of like who gets to decide what's illness and who is being diagnosed as having illness, these are the kinds of questions that sociologists are asking. So let's look at an example here. We could think about obesity as being socially constructed. So if you're not familiar with the concept of obesity and how it's defined, it's based on body mass index, right, or BMI. And body mass index is calculated as your weight in pounds divided by your height in inches squared. This is not what the formula looked like before. Weight in pounds divided by height in inches squared. That fraction then is multiplied by 703. That will give you your body mass index. And so you can sense from this that your BMI obviously is different, right, depending on the ratio of your height and your weight. And so there's this breakdown here where rather than calculating it, you could really just look at your height and your weight and find your BMI. And you'll notice that they've done something really handy here, which is to classify every BMI level into 5 different categories: underweight, normal weight, overweight, obesity, and extreme obesity. So you'll see not only the colors, but also underneath each category name, you'll see how exactly it is that somebody gets to be classified in one of those particular categories. Well, then you might ask, how did these categories come to be, right? This is where the social construction comes in. We think of obesity as being like you're either obese or you're not, which according to this, that is true. But somebody created these categories. It turns out that these categories were created by the World Health Organization in 1995. And those cutoffs were based on a lot of research, mostly on men, where, and the gender differences, the sex differences were figured out later, but the categories were created based on the correlation between body mass and mortality or death. So people who had BMIs between about 18.5 and 25 tended to have the lowest mortality risk. And you saw that mortality risk increase when people had BMI less than 18.5, and you saw it increase when people had BMI greater than 25. But these are pretty arbitrary cutoffs, right? Like, why not 29 instead of 30 for obesity? So there's questions about these cutoffs. Why are they exactly that? Because if you, for example, if you're at a 29.9, really what is the difference between you being overweight and obese? It's a pretty arbitrary cutoff. The other criticism of BMI is that it's not necessarily body mass that is the problem, but rather the percentage of body fat that contributes to diseases and to mortality. And BMI is not really a good measure of body body fat. And you could have two people who weigh the same and who are the same height, but have vastly different bodily compositions and have the same BMI, right, in terms of their composition of muscle and fat. And so even though there's critique of these categories, they still have consequences, right? We are very hesitant to be labeled as obese or even worse, extremely obese. And if that label becomes attached to us, that could have consequences for us in our social lives, right? If you follow the news recently, you may have seen that the president had a physical, and there was some discussion of his health statistics, and height and weight were included in that. And somebody from the New York Times noted that in the past, he's always put that his height was 6'2". Well, on this physical, his height was listed at 6'3", and in combination with his weight, gave him a BMI that was below 30, where if his height had been listed at 6.2, his BMI would have been 30 or above. So that distinction has real consequences, even though it was created by human beings sort of arbitrarily. So we build on this idea then that illness is socially constructed. That is really the basis for the argument that medicine can be used as an agent of social control. So you've got these, your book talks about 3 ways that medicine is used as an agent of social control. One is medicalization, which is the process through which a condition or a behavior becomes defined as a medical problem that requires a medical solution. Medicalization also happens when the definition is broadened to include more conditions or behaviors. So something that has already been classified as a medical issue, other types of behaviors associated with that could then be brought into that definition to make it bigger and to essentially increase the scope of control that medicine has around that particular set of behaviors. The book also talks about genetic research as a form of social control, right? So genetic testing is becoming increasingly popular, and this has an effect on individuals. People who support genetic testing want to be able to test people for particular kinds of genetic markers, in part because they want to generate knowledge and also because they want to inform people, right? They want to equip people with knowledge about themselves and their families. But the intent there is probably also to get those people to change their behavior in light of what they learn, right? So this is another example of the institution of medicine sort of having an impact or seeking to have an impact on the way that people behave. And then the third thing that your book talks about is the idea of the sick role as a form of social control. So in sociology, the concept of a social role, so for example, student, friend, those are social roles. And social roles come with certain social expectations. So if you're a student, you're expected to get good grades and be courteous to your professors. If you're a friend, you're expected to be supportive. These are social expectations that come with particular social roles. Well, being sick can also be a social role. And Talcott Parsons is a sociologist who was doing work in the 1950s, and he argued that being sick can be a role. And he argued that when we have an illness, we're expected to act in a certain way. And so your book outlines the 4 sort of components of the sick role. And he talks about how as a society, we've developed an idea of illness as being undesirable. And so we have been socialized, and we socialize others around us to behave in line with those expectations, right? To conform with society's expectations when we are ill. I am going to really focus on medicalization for the rest of this lecture because I think your book does a pretty good job of explaining genetic research and the sick role. So let me give you one example of medicalization that your book does not talk about, and then also an example of what they call demedicalization. So medicalization, right, is basically defining something that has not been thought of medically as a medical problem that needs to be solved with medical intervention. So one example of this is the medicalization of childbirth. So here you have the argument that medical professionals are intervening in what has historically been a natural process. So pregnancy and childbirth are seen as medically hazardous, right? That it can be dangerous to have a baby, and that having a child, because it's dangerous, is something that's in need of a medical solution. So where does the social control of it all come in? Well, first there's this idea that if you're having a baby outside of a hospital, that is not good, right? Non-hospital births are really frowned upon and seen as deviant. Now, this is changing. The trends of out-of-hospital births, the numbers are actually increasing over the last maybe 10 years. So you're seeing an uptick in the percentage of babies that are born outside of hospitals. So you're starting to see essentially more women rejecting this idea that you have to be in a hospital to have a baby. But this is something that for the last at least 100 years has been a medical process, right? Having a baby has been a medical process, and if you do it in another way, you're seen as sort of weird, right? The second sort of aspect of this social control is that the medicalization of childbirth really alienates mothers from the experience of actually having the baby, because you have all of this intervention, lots of people sort of getting into the mix of childbirth. And so what used to maybe be something that was a positive experience for mothers can become really stressful. And then if you also think about this through a feminist lens, right, there's a lot of feminist scholars from anthropology, from sociology, from medicine, from public health, who argue that the intervention of medicine in the 18th and 19th centuries into childbirth is really because doctors were men, the insertion of men into childbirth, when it has historically been something that women have done, right, with midwives, with other women in the community. And so you have this situation where men are claiming dominance and expertise and power in the experience of childbirth, where that had not historically been the case. And so research shows that, we have improved birth outcomes. There is reduced infant mortality and reduced infant mortality, but there are also some other negative consequences of the medicalization of childbirth. One of these is this idea of the cascade of interventions. So this is where, when you're in a hospital, you're having a baby, having one medical intervention sets off the need for another medical intervention, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll put a video up in the additional resources section, really short, 2 minutes, for you to get an idea of what they're talking about. But for example, if a woman goes in to have a baby and she wants to have an epidural, which takes the pain away, that also slows down the labor process. Well, slowing down the labor process is not good for the baby, and it's not good for the mother. So then the second intervention is this medicine called Pitocin. Pitocin speeds up childbirth and labor, but it also brings on longer contractions, and they're stronger contractions. So then the mother starts to experience more pain. So then the medical personnel around the mother pump up the epidural again. Well, that slows down the labor, and then you have more Pitocin. Well, then the mother doesn't feel anything, but the baby is becoming distressed because it's stuck in the mother's body. And then you have an emergency C-section, which is really not the best outcome. C-sections are safe but not preferred. So I'll put up a video to sort of show you that they talk about this idea of this cascade of interventions. And research actually shows that women who give birth in larger hospital units are more likely to experience these kinds of interventions. They're not necessary for every mother. Every childbirthing experience is different, but for the most part, with normal births, this is not necessary. So that's one example of medicalization. Now, if you shift over to this idea of demedicalization, we can talk about the demedicalization of homosexuality. So, in American society, Western European society, you have this sort of progression of at least in the last 200 years of society seeing homosexuality as a moral failing, right? The Bible teaches you that this is bad and that this is a moral failing on the individual's part. Then there's a move to seeing homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder, so something that's wrong with the person's brain and mental state. And now what you tend to see broadly, although this is not true for everybody, you tend to see this idea that homosexuality is a normal variation, that people are born with their sexual orientation, and that this is a normal variation of sexuality, that you have different variations. This is just one of them. But this is where the scientific community is today. And so I'll just walk you through sort of how this sequence unfolded. So you have first, starting in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association releases the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. The DSM-1, right, which was just the DSM, was released in 1952, and the DSM-2 in 1968. Both of these classified homosexuality as a paraphilia, so sociopathic personality disturbance or sexual deviation, something that was a disorder, right? After the 6th printing of the DSM-2, you have, and leading up through that, right, you have a lot of scientific sex research that is starting to argue that homosexuality is not pathological, right? It's not a disorder. And then you have, culturally, you're starting to see the beginnings of the gay rights movement, right? So starting with the Stonewall riots in New York City. And so in 1974, with the release of the DSM-2 7th printing, the classification changes and is put under, homosexuality is put under a new category titled sexual orientation disturbance. And then in 1980, the DSM-3 changes that to ego dystonic homosexuality, both of which refer to this desire to change one's sexual attractions, really focusing specifically on homosexuality. Now, the issue here, aside from it still considered to be a disorder, is this term change. And so these classifications sort of legitimated what's referred to as sexual conversion therapy. So this idea that you could use shock therapy or some other kind of therapy to convert somebody from homosexuality back to heterosexuality, right? Because the idea was that was the natural state of being, was heterosexuality. And so if they had a desire to change their sexual attraction, that is something that could be achieved through therapy. This is not supported by the American Psychological Association today. This idea of sexual conversion therapy is not something that's supported by them or really anybody else in the scientific community. With the revised version of the DSM-3, references to homosexuality were removed. And so right now, We're in the 5th version, which was released in 2013. There are some references to sort of distress about one's sexual orientation, but there are no longer specific references to homosexuality in the DSM. What is now becoming a debate is a classification in the DSM-5 about gender identity disorder, which is in reference to people who are transgender, right? Whose gender and sex identity do not match, right? So people who are not cisgender. So that is a current debate that I won't get into here. It's worth looking up if you're interested. And so this is an example of demedicalization, right? Where actually medicalization and then demedicalization, if you look at sort of the whole sequence of how we have thought about homosexuality across time, this sort of reach of psychiatry, which is part of the medical institution, this reach of psychiatry to include homosexuality under its sort of umbrella of jurisdiction, if you will, and then really social movements against that to sort of take homosexuality out of this idea of a disorder and reclassify it as a normal type of behavior or a normal sort of orientation. So that is what I have for you on medicine as an institution of social control. I've posted a documentary for you to watch called The Medicated Child. And as you're watching this, I want you to think about what you've read in the chapter and what we've talked about here, and think about how these ideas of medicalization, of social control, of the social construction of illness apply to the story that's being told around ADHD. And I will talk to you next week.